Oversight hearing. Today we're focused on identifying the numerous security failures that preceded and continue to persist following the breach of the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. Although it has been more than 2 years, there are still many unanswered questions. Former Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats spent millions of dollars on their select committee to investigate January 6, yet the committee failed to investigate the real security failures. Today we are joined by Chief Sund, who was Chief of the United States Capitol Police on that day. The Democrat Select Committee never invited Chief Sund to testify during one of their primetime hearings, despite him being the Chief of Police on January 6. Perhaps that is because his testimony didn't fit with their preconceived narrative.
All right, thank you. You know, it's very, very disheartening to read this narrative of when you asked for help, and the 2 days before they didn't care about doing something because it may have looked bad. When therefore, none of us in this room are saying what happened on January 6th was correct. But I absolutely believe the conditions for that to occur rest at the former Speaker's lap and the two sergeant-at-arms and complicit with other individuals. You know, it's one thing for something to occur, but it's another thing to create the conditions for that to occur. Let me ask you this. I'm reading here, Mr. Irving only provided security information to Republicans after receiving distinct instructions from Democratic leadership. On January 4th, he sent a text to Fleet asking him to, quote, act surprised when Irving emailed him and his Republican counterpart information about the joint session. Is there anything wrong with that?
Just want to make sure I understand.
So Fleet basically, Irving basically asked Fleet to act surprised about the information when he was sending it to the Republican. In other words, he knew the information before, but he was withholding it from the minority party.
That's one of the big problems you have with the Capitol Police Board and the Sergeant Arms. They're too politicized.
Well, did you resign because you wanted to?
No, I didn't. I love the Capitol Police. I love the men and women.
I personally believe you were a scapegoat. You were a scapegoat of conditions that were set forth where you could not succeed. What happened on January 6th was unforgivable, but the conditions were set forth by the former Speaker and two sergeant-at-arms for the conditions for that to occur. Absolutely. I don't care if the National Guard were out there. I don't care about optics. I care about safety. Absolutely. And it's a dereliction of duty of the former Speaker, her staff, and the two sergeant-at-arms.
The gentleman yields. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. Chief Sund, since January 6, 2021, have you testified or been asked to testify publicly before a committee of the House of Representatives?
No, sir.
Did the January 6 Select Committee ask you to publicly testify before their committee?
No, sir.
But you did testify in the Senate, correct?
Yes, sir. The Senate combined hearing, I think it was February 23rd.
Can you briefly tell us about that?
It was a combined hearing. I think it was a really good approach of how to come in and address it. Initially, they did not want anybody that was no longer in their position to testify, which would have excluded myself, Senate Sergeant Arms Stenger, and House Sergeant Arms Irving. And I went and specifically asked the Senate Rules Committee, please let me come and testify. I will testify in person to show up. They changed the rules and allowed me to show up.
So you had to basically force yourself in to even be able to testify before the Senate committee.
I had to call in somebody I knew there and tell them, I promise you, I will show up in person. I was the only one to be there in person, not on video.
Thank you for your vigilance there. Chief Sund, you previously testified on January 3rd, 2020, or on January 3, 2021, 3 days before January 6. You met separately with House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving and Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael Stenger. And you asked them to approve a request for National Guard assistance on the 6th. Now, this is on January the 3rd. I believe this was in your book that you met with both Stenger and Irvin and requested National Guard assistance to be ready on the 6th. Can you explain what happened in those two meetings with Irving and Stenger?
Absolutely. So on the morning of the 3rd at 9:24 a.m., I specifically went to see him because I know what a big deal it is to have National Guard come and assist us on the Hill. I went into his office again, 9:24 in the morning, went up and immediately went up and said, hey, I'd like to bring in the National Guard to support me to assist me on the perimeter, because when we have a joint session of Congress, it takes a lot of our personnel inside. But immediately, as soon as I asked him, his first response was, I don't know, I don't like the optics of that. And his second response was, besides, the intelligence doesn't support it. He immediately, then we began talking, he said, have you reached out to Mike Stinger on this? I said, no, I have not talked to him about it yet. He said, why don't you talk to Stinger and see what he has to say? So then I left, went over to Mike Stinger's office at 9:35 in the morning, walked into his office, he wasn't there. I came back, he showed up at 11:13, I showed back up at 11:53 and went in to immediately ask him, I'd like to request the National Guard. He said, let's come up with another idea. Why don't you call, do you know somebody at the National Guard? I said, yes, sir, I know General William Walker. He said, why don't you call Walker and see if we need them, how quickly could they get here, and how many people could they send us? So I called William Walker 6:14 p.m. that night. He told me they have 125 people assisting with COVID response. He could reallocate those fairly quickly once he got Secretary of Defense approval and send them over.
Okay. When you met with Stinger, had Irvin given him heads up that you were coming to ask for National Guard?
Yeah, later on, after January 6th, specifically on April 8th, I went and had lunch with Mike Stinger. And I asked him, because it was kind of unusual. He came up with that idea so quickly when I went walking in. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Stinger, you came up with that response fairly quickly for me to call General Walker. And he had told me Paul Irving had called him ahead of time and said, son came here looking for asking for the National Guard. We got to come up with another plan. Pelosi will never go for it.
Yields, I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
So, Mr. Sund, you also did not anticipate that you wouldn't get significant intelligence about the threat. Isn't that true?
That is correct. With the intelligence,
You would have anticipated that either your own department or other federal agencies would have alerted you to the risk. Isn't that true?
like I've said, this could have been preventable if we had gotten the intelligence they had.
And isn't it also true that you would not have anticipated and did not anticipate that you wouldn't get support from up the chain when you requested the National Guard before and on January 6th? Isn't that true?
That is correct, sir.
And during a February 2021 joint Senate hearing, former House Sergeant at Arms Paul Irving testified that on January 6, 2021, he did not receive a request from you for National Guard assistance until around 2 p.m. Is that accurate?
That is not accurate, sir.
When did you ask for it?
12:58 p.m. was my first call to Paul Irving. I had a number of people that were surrounding me that were aware I was calling, and he was fully aware of just how bad it was outside because he had his representative to the command center right behind me sending him all the information of what was happening. And I did not get the approval at 12:58 p.m.
And he still said he was going to run it up the chain.
He's going to run it up the chain. It took 71 minutes to get an approval.
To get it run up the chain.
Yes, sir.
And your assumption, although you testified that you don't know for sure that it went to Nancy Pelosi, your assumption is that because the Sergeant at Arms, while elected by the members of the House, is generally put on the ballot by the Speaker and serves at the direction of the Speaker, so you assumed, as most people would, that it was the Speaker that was the top of the chain.
Yeah, that was my assumption.
Based on the flow chart that I'm aware of, there is nobody between the Sergeant at Arms and the Speaker. Do you know of somebody in between the two of them?
No, sir, I don't.
I don't either. All right. Now, you had some phone calls with Mr. Irving. Do you have the records of what times you had those phone calls?
Yes, sir, I do.
Would you please tell them to the committee?
Let's see, if I don't have them, I'd be happy to submit my phone records. My phone records have all been submitted. They were submitted to the Senate hearing, full accounting of my phone records. Yeah, I don't have hold on just a second. I don't have the exact times.
But you made, my recollection is, and I've read your book, but my recollection is you made several calls within a relatively short period of time. If it took 71 minutes to run up the chain, is my information correct that you called 3 times, the first one that you just told us about, and then 2 more during that 71 minutes?
No. Those are calls with Speaker Pelosi. Those that I just went over those times, those were calls with Speaker Pelosi.
Those were calls with Speaker Pelosi.
Between 12:58 and 2:09, when I finally got approval 71 minutes later, I made 11 calls to the Sergeant at Arms asking what's going on. First asking for the request, and then 10 follow-up calls saying what's going on with the request.
11 calls during the
Yes, and
roughly an hour and 10 minutes.
during that time, I was calling every leader of every agency, Gary Settles with Virginia State Police, Secret Service, anybody I could get to come to my aid. I activated mutual aid around the Maryland, Virginia, and that's what brought in the New Jersey State Police at 1:51 p.m. Still while calling every couple of minutes to find out where the hell my approval was for the National Guard.
At this time, I'll recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Stahl, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Loudermilk, for hosting today's hearing. Thank you, Chief Sund, for being here today. Members of the committee and Congress are thankful for your prior service to the U.S. Capitol Police and your commitment to protecting members, staff, and visitors. My priority as chairman of the Committee on House Administration is to depoliticize Capitol Police. I'm committed to ensuring the U.S. Capitol Police has the tools, resources, and leadership it needs to keep our community safe. I also remain committed to supporting our law enforcement officers and the work they do each day. Today, we're here to discuss the security failures that occurred on January 6, 2021, and how we can prevent these failures from occurring again. I want to dive into the questions, Chief Sund. In your transcribed interview, you mentioned that you met with the House Sergeant at Arms regarding the National Guard prior to January 6th. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And who was the House Sergeant at Arms leading up to and on January 6th?
That would be Paul Irving.
And the House Sergeant at Arms is appointed by who?
As appointed at that time by Speaker Pelosi.
And in your transcribed interview, you mentioned that when you first brought up the National Guard to the House Sergeant at Arms in the days leading up to January 6, that Mr. Irving said he, quote, didn't like the optics, end quote. Is that correct?
That is correct. He referenced being concerned for optics.
And on January 6, when you went to Mr. Irving to get his approval to call in the Guard, Mr. Irving said he would, quote, run it up the chain. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was a telephone call. I didn't see him in person when I first made that request.
The House Sergeant at Arms is considered probably the most senior security official on the House side. When Mr. Irving says he has to, quote, run it up the chain, end quote, what did that mean?
I took that to mean his leadership chain.
And who would be his leadership chain?
It would
If
be
he's functionally the most senior security official on the House side, correct?
That's his title. That's part of the title, the senior law enforcement official for the House of Representatives. But he would have been referring to the leadership team that goes up to Speaker Pelosi.
So the political leadership team, meaning elected officials, not another security official, is that your
That
understanding?
is correct, sir. He's the top security official for the House.
So running up the chain would most likely, in your opinion, is through the Speaker's office and possibly to Speaker Pelosi?
That would be where it ends, yes.
Okay, so let's park that there, and then let's jump to a second set here. In a press conference on January 7th, Speaker Pelosi called for your resignation on national television. Speaker Pelosi also stated that she had not talked to you since the initial breach of the Capitol. But according to your transcribed interview, you were on the phone with Speaker Pelosi a few times. Can you explain that discrepancy?
Yeah, that is correct. I spoke to Speaker Pelosi 3 times that evening, and she went on national TV and said I'd never spoken to her, but I spoke to her 3 times. The three times were, the first time when I went over to brief Vice President Pence at the secure location. I'd called House Sergeant at Arms Irving, told him I was going over to brief the Vice President. I was also going over to do a personal assessment of the Capitol. At that point, things were getting under control. Went over there, briefed him on when we can get them back into chambers with, Mr. Irving being fully aware. He said he wanted to get Speaker Pelosi on the phone. He made a phone call from his cell phone at approximately 5:34, where I first briefed Speaker Pelosi. The second call was when I left that location. As I was walking away, I met up with Mr. Stenger, and we started walking over to the Senate to go brief the Senate, when Jennifer Hemingway, I believe it was Jennifer Hemingway, handed me the cell phone, and it was Emily Barrett's cell phone calling her, and it was Speaker Pelosi on the other line. This is my second call with Speaker Pelosi, questioning the information I'd given to Vice President Pence about when we can get back into chambers. I assured her that information was correct. I could get them back into chambers by 7 p.m., and the call ended. That was call number 2. Call number 3 was 6:25 p.m. I was over at the Senate from the secure location, from where the Senate had been sequestered, and on a cell phone using Robert Karam's cell phone, they dialed leadership, who was over off-site at a secure location, and I briefed all of the leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have one call, you didn't have two calls, you had three calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
That is correct, sir.
Let me shift gears and go back as it relates to the optics of bringing people up to Capitol Hill and running things up the chain of command, ultimately to the Speaker's office. Do you think Speaker Pelosi's office or Speaker Pelosi herself politicized Capitol security?
I have no idea on that, sir.
Okay. Any other clarifications you'd like to make as it relates to Speaker Pelosi's comments that you didn't speak to her?
I just, wish she had considered that, wish she had considered some of the stuff that I faced and the efforts I went through to bring in the outside resources on that day before she called for my resignation.
Thank you very much for being here. I yield back.
Gentlemen,